Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and taught to have no fear. I was brought up and taught to have no fear. I was brought up and taught to have no fear.
Welcome to Full Circle Podcast number 12. I'm your host, or one of your hosts, rather, David Roberts, along with the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes. Absent today is our oral historian, Andre Taylor. Dr. Holmes, last week was a great week. Sorry you were missing, but we discussed hip hop. We brought you up several times, and I talked about some of the things that you taught me about the last poets, Lord Jazz, and Do It All. They sent their regards during the broadcast. One thing I want to talk about, since we talked about hip hop last week, I think we got to talk about DMX. Our prayers and thoughts go out to DMX and his family. And one thing I think about when I see DMX struggling with what he's struggling with, and this is what I like about him, he never glorified drug use. Like as we've seen with some rappers, they glorify sipping syrup or popping pills or taking Percocet. DMX has always been, he may have mentioned smoking a blunt, which most rappers, talk about. But he has always openly talked about the fact that he struggles with this crack addiction. And he's always been very open and honest. And he had tremendous success, early on with his albums or CDs, whatever we want to call them. And then he kind of seamlessly transitioned into movies and was doing so well. And I always wondered, man, this guy has so much success. Why can't he just leave these drugs alone? But as we all know, addiction is serious. Addiction is serious. What do you think about what's going on with DMX right now?
Well, I didn't follow him greatly, but I think in terms of addiction, addiction in our community, period, and addiction in the entertainment industry, and that addiction includes alcohol as a drug, and the opiates, and then the cocaine derivatives, all of those things are running throughout our community. And like you say, honesty and open discussion is really going to be kind of important in this whole thing. And if you go back to it, there's a whole big political piece in terms of how we deal with addiction. Right around the turn of the century, when I say turn of the century, I mean early 1900s, white women were the people most likely addicted to opiates, to heroin. And the way they dealt with it was by education and so forth. Wasn't through criminalization, and they were removed from that whole usage thing. So I think we need to rethink as a country or as a society how we deal with this question of addiction as disease and not as a character flaw. And something that's quite difficult, to deal with, to take on, and so we can see people that are, back in my generation, we had, it was quite almost, very, because I had a friend who was on the road, who was a excellent jazz musician, and he never, he said, I mean, this guy was good, but he loved his family, and to do what he did, to get so quote unquote big, he had to go on the road, and he couldn't go on the road. He said the road is rough, and a lot of people, that's where they get addicted, on the road and living that road life. And there was a time when the record companies would actually try to get you strung out, get you addicted, the labels, because that way they'd have, that way they could actually control you. Absolutely. And they could build a drug right into your not openly into your contract, but built that in. So this country in many ways was founded on addictive stuff. Tobacco was the first cash crop. It's probably one of the most addictive substances there is, nicotine.
Right.
And then rum, out of the sugar that was done down in the islands in the Caribbean, which was turned into rum. The rum was later used as kind of a part of the uh, things that we were sold for. So addiction is built into our oppression, and we need to understand that it's not just individual character flaw, but it's a economic piece, and it's going to take a whole society to kind of to deal with how we deal with these things. That's interesting, and I'm probably talking too much, but it's interesting. Oregon, a very predominantly white state. I think it might just be Portland, but they're going to legalize everything. Right now, we have about 20 states that are legalizing marijuana, and Virginia just legalized. Well, by July, it'll be legal to possess up to an ounce and to grow it up to 4 plants. But and there'll be a legal, quote unquote, legal market in 3 years, and so it joins other states, make 20 states. But in Oregon, parts of Oregon, they're talking about legalization of just about everything.
You know, and that's interesting because we talked about this earlier when we had author and lawyer J.J. Winston on the show about the attitudes changing towards addiction. And one thing that I'm happy to see is that with what DMX is going through, as I understand it now, he's in a coma. There's been no brain function. And primarily from what I've been listening to, of course, I haven't been listening to or watching Fox News, any of those guys, but the media that I've heard, people have been very compassionate, you know, saying, you know, our hearts and prayers and thoughts go out to DMX, because I think people are starting to realize that, you know, it's a mental health issue in many ways. I know you said you never got into DMX, but recently on, I believe it was BET, they had a 5-part series on the Rough Riders record label that DMX got started on. And DMX told his story, and it was obvious that he was in pain, that he was in serious emotional pain, and he experienced emotional trauma as a child. And then he also talked about when he was like 14, that some older guy like gave him his first crack rock or cocaine or something like that. And DMX as an adult is saying, what, you know, who would do that to a young person? That's, you know, not something that you should be doing. And then he sends him on this odyssey, you know, 20, 30-year odyssey where he's struggling with this. Now, when we talk about attitudes toward addiction, which you touched on, this would be a good jump off point or a good segue into the Derek Chauvin trial. But before we go there, I would be remiss if I did not mention Prince Marky D, because when I talked to you and I said, I want to talk about DMX, he's like, we got to give some love to Prince Marky D too, you know, from the legendary group, the Fat Boys, recently passed away. So, you know, rest in peace to Marky D. But moving on to the Derek Chauvin trial, and for many of you who may not know this, Derek Chauvin is, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, is the police officer that knelt on George Floyd and for 9 minutes had his knee on his neck and ended up killing him. And the reason that I say a lot of people may not know that is because in this situation, just like in the Trayvon Martin situation, sometimes it's the victim that gets put on trial. So more people probably think of this as the George Floyd trial, just like many people thought of the George Zimmerman trial as the Trayvon Martin trial, but it's not. It's the Derek Chauvin trial. He's on trial. But interestingly enough, you know, when we talk about attitudes towards addiction, I was watching, you know, my little update of the trial today, and they're talking about, Dr. Holmes, I don't know if you saw this, but they're talking about the drugs that George Floyd had in his system, you know, fentanyl, a little meth, so on and so forth, which is interesting to me because, okay, if he had those drugs, they would make him high, but the drugs aren't what killed him. So, I mean, I can't even understand why they're even allowed to talk about that so long. I guess I've been watching too much Law and Order, expecting Jack McCoy to jump up and say irrelevant or, you know, I object. Why do you think they're allowed to even go into this at length?
Well, because it's a question that, and you have a judge that's pretty lenient. The judge itself is pretty lenient, and he's allowed some things in the trial that might not have been allowed otherwise. He allowed a reassertion at the defense's request for a third degree, murder. At first it was, I think, second degree and maybe first degree and something like that. So second degree. So he's allowing things that's can shift the outcome of the case. This particular lawyer, this defense lawyer, is very effective in the sense that he's gotten off several policemen before in similar types of cases. So he's won basically by putting Black folks on trial, or like you say, the victim in this case,
Absolutely,
on trial. And we have to understand that as Black folks in this country, as African people in this country, we are always considered to be on the perpetrator of something negative. They did a psychological study, and they would show pictures of people with knives, and they would have a Black man with a knife, a white man with a knife stabbing a Black person. But the majority of white folks, when you would ask them what did they see, they said they saw a Black person with a knife stabbing a white person. So even though you have right in front of them a picture of a Black person being stabbed by a white person, their brain, which is many times shaped by racist ideas, sees something, forces you to see something else. Your brain is what helps you perceive what you perceive, and the lawyer understands that, and that's what he's trying to shape toward the jury. And I'll just say one thing, then I'll stop. But one of the things we have to see too and think about too is that right when this occurred, the whole country saw it because of the COVID-19. People were at home,
right.
and sports were off, all the kind of usual distractions were off, and all of a sudden you saw this, and right away, whites at that particular point, a lot of them saw it, and they saw what they saw. Later, you had a really strong move on even people, including people like Donald Trump, to say, hey, there's something else going on here. It's not just, he didn't really just kill this guy. This guy was full of drugs and all this other stuff. And that's also the narrative that's out there in the right-wing press and the right-wing social media. So by the defense taking up that discussion, what they're actually doing is buying into what's already showing up in people's social media accounts and what's floating around in largely in white communities. And he's buying into an argument that's kind of sub rosa, kind of underground, but that people, a lot of people are buying into.
What was interesting, when it first happened, I saw Rush Limbaugh, may he rest in peace, on the Breakfast Club, and I was thinking he was going to do the same thing, try to vilify George Floyd, and he was adamant, at that time, that was when it first happened, that it was wrong and that he shouldn't have had his, knee on his neck and so on and so forth. And I was just actually pleasantly surprised to see that reaction. But I'm not surprised that, even after that initial reaction, like you said, some people came out with a new narrative because, of course, they were looking for a new narrative. And this trial has me, not a little concerned, very concerned, because I thought the Trayvon Martin incident, and I did it myself, the George Zimmerman trial, I thought that was an open and shut case. It's like he stalked this kid and then killed this kid. And then afterwards, we found out that The kid wasn't breaking into any homes. He lived in the neighborhood. He lived there with his dad, you know, so on and so forth. But then we got the outcome that we had, you know, and not just the outcome, but George Zimmerman was made into a hero by some people. And this kid, there was no sympathy for this child.
Right.
You know, there was actually more sympathy, interestingly enough, when you had the school shootings. What was the very first school shootings out there in Colorado?
Oh, Columbine.
Columbine, exactly. That used to be rolled off the tip of my tongue. Now it's like 20 years. So when you had those school shootings in Columbine, people had a lot of compassion for the shooters. Like, oh, they were picked on, they were this, they were that. But then Trayvon Martin is stalked in his own neighborhood, going to the store and killed. And there's no, you know, compassion for him from, you know, a certain segment of the population. So that's kind of how I'm looking at this Derek Chauvin trial. To me, it's like an open and shut case. But do you think, what do you think is the chance of him being convicted?
Well, it's I think it's a pretty good chance. I mean, the prosecution might be going a little bit in terms of overkill, in terms of, you know, how many lawyers they have, and they bringing in, you know, about a whole bunch of high-powered lawyers. Sometimes that can boomerang, because the defense doesn't appear to have as many, but they have a huge staff that's in the background, and they have lots. So it looks as if the prosecution has more money than the defense, but actually the defense is really well funded, and it's downplaying how much money is coming, how much money it has, and so that can kind of boomerang. But I think it's a good chance, but I wouldn't, in this country, in this what we call settler colony, I wouldn't bet. I would never put all my money on the side of righteousness,
Right.
you know, in this place. But because we can see that at one point, it was an overwhelming number of whites who were really appalled at what happened. But now you see those numbers are really shrinking, and now it's just slightly over half, I think, that say that what happened was a bad thing, was unjust. So we see how social pressure and how the impact of the social media can really change people's thinking on these questions here. But you have a very able prosecution, but you know, the defense was very effective at removing a number of blacks were removed, and especially black women were removed from the jury. So so we'll see how this thing works.
Now, transitioning from that, let's go into our next big topic. You know, this is our first show in a while, but we haven't had a guest, you know, so we get to discuss all these topics. We were talking earlier about the Georgia voting bill. And, you know, it's so interesting. It's so difficult when something like this comes out and it has has partisanship written all over it. You know, like people are split down party lines about how they feel about something. It's hard to find just the facts about it. You know, as I was looking, you know, trying to research and find what's in the Georgia voting bill, I'm getting articles that are, you know, opinions, you know, this is going to do this is going to do that, you know, but it was difficult to find just straight up, you know, information. So here's some of the things that I found, and maybe we can discuss these. They're talking about restricting voting hours. And so I guess legally, they could have the voting hours be from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., but it's my understanding that it could be as limited as 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I don't know what you think about that, but I know a lot of people that work 9 to 5 may not have flexible jobs. you know, so that would put them in a position where it will restrict their vote. So what's your thought on that voting hours piece?
Well, I think one of the things it might have done, and it was one of the problems is that it's given a lot of discretion to localities, and so you're going to have a lot of variation all across the board in terms of how that bill was going to be carried out in the state of Georgia, and I think beyond Georgia, across the country, the United States is probably about the only industrial country, Western country, that does not have elections to be like a holiday. In many countries, in many European countries, when you have elections, that's like a holiday. That's a day off, and you go there and you vote, and that's, you know, it's just a day off, and you have that time, and registration. Again, this is state by state, so every registration is different. But in most European countries, you can register right up almost up until the day of the election, and so that's another aspect of it. So I think there are a lot of restrictions here, and some of the restrictions are, you know, like removal of those drop boxes, or limiting the number of drop boxes and that sort of thing. That builds on what's already a problem, because we have communities, in our communities, we have fewer precincts, fewer voting areas. And so you'll see these long lines of African people lining up to vote. And you go into a white neighborhood and very short lines, and because you have more voting precincts. So those are all things that make it difficult. And like you were saying, if you don't have enough time, so you might even have a long enough vote. And we've had instances where people lined up to vote, but because the elections were cut off at a certain time, they didn't let those people who lined up complete the voting process. Right. So all of that goes into this thing.
And it's interesting, and I want to talk about a couple other components of the law, but it seems like people who are supporters of this law feel that it's going to cut down on voter fraud. And voter fraud didn't seem like it became an issue until, you know, Trump was, and I wouldn't even say elected, but even when he came in, you know, he was talking about if I don't win, it's voter fraud. Anything that talks, you know, against him was fake news, you know, and it's just, that's fine if he's that narcissistic and that's his ego, but it's amazing that so many people were, you know, willing to follow that narrative.
Well, it's an old narrative, and actually it predated Trump. I mean, in the recent period, because you had all of these voter ID laws that were being put on the table before Trump came to the presidency, and the big thing was the Supreme Court decision in that Shelby case, which was in 2008, 2009, somewhere in there, where they gutted the Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, and that one really put a damper on any. If Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was still in place, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be happening now, because that would be up for really federal review. So right now we have voting rights laws, restrictive voting rights laws being passed in a number of the states, and in the majority of the states. And this gets back to another aspect here I don't want to forget to raise, and that is that this is 2021. Last year was 2020. It's the year that ended in zero. For all the elections that end in zero, we call those 0-year elections, and they're important because your census is done in those years, and then you have a apportionment of congressional districts in each state. And what the right, let's say the Republican Party has done better than the Democratic Party, is organized states. So the Republicans control probably about 30, 34, 35 states, maybe 32 states. And they may control everything in about maybe 25 states or so. That means they control that process in terms of who gets elected and what those districts are going to look like. And so they can build in districts that are going to be automatically favor them and limit their opposition. So one of the ways that you control national politics is by controlling states. The other thing that that we have to look at is that there are roughly about 3,000 counties in the United States. And up until fairly recently, the last 30 years or so, Democrats and Republicans roughly control equal amounts of the state, about 1,500 or so of the states, of the counties. But now Democrats can get elected to the White House with 750 of those counties because their population is concentrated in the big cities and the surrounding suburbs, and they don't have much of a following in the rural and small towns across this country. So they lose. That's how you lose Senate seats, and so you might have a majority of the voters, but you have a minority of the counties that you actually have in your under your control or under your influence, let's say. And so this is what makes for this kind of right-wing populism that's coming up, because these folks say we're the real people, and the people in the cities and suburbs say we're the real people. And what buttresses the whole thing is that you know we're headed to a period. If the virus doesn't kill us all off, we're headed to a period in which you have a majority of people who are a majority minority country, so to speak, a country where Blacks, Latinos, and others, and along with progressive whites, you know, become this new majority, and so that's one of the things that that many people on the right have difficulties dealing with. They could deal with a majority Black or majority Black population as long as those Blacks were in slavery,
Right, like in South Africa.
Right. Oh, no, here. I'm talking about in South Carolina, they could deal with a Black majority as long as we were enslaved. They could deal with 50% Blacks in Mississippi as long as we were enslaved, or had no voting rights or no citizenship rights whatsoever, or no, very few what we call democratic rights, national democratic rights. Or they can deal with Latino people as long as they're just working and going home and not being involved in the politics and not having their ideas being felt outside of just in the workplace. So once those folks started speaking up and talking about their interests, then they become a problem where there hadn't been a problem or had been a different type of problem before. So these things become a problem for people who look at this country not as a Native American country, but look at it as a white country. They kind of erased the fact that we had all kinds of indigenous nations on this planet, on this country before Europeans came here. And so they look at their birthright, so to speak, as being removed.
And and that's a good jump off point for the last two pieces of the Georgia voting bill that I wanted to talk about, and wanted to get your take on the ID laws and the law restricting water, which I couldn't believe when I read that, giving out water at the poll place. What would you what exactly is the ID law? And what would you say to people who would say, well, what's the problem with just getting proper ID?
Well, the problem is how is proper ID defined in any particular state law.
Mhm.
Different states have, for instance, Virginia just revamped its some of its state laws, a lot of its state laws. But but before, previously, what they would say is that in terms of ID, uh, your gun license would work, but your student ID would not work. So your college student ID couldn't work. It had a picture on it and so forth, but it wouldn't work. So many times the ID laws are skewed to favor a particular population. And then we have some older folks who don't have access in our community, African American community. We have some folks who don't have access all the time to all forms of ID, even all forms of background documentation. And study after study shows that the biggest group that are going to lose out in terms of voting laws are not some non-citizen, but are actually African people who were born and raised in this country, who've been here for centuries, whose families have been here for centuries. And so that's the thinking behind the folks who oppose those restrictive voting laws and restrictive ID laws. The other thing that's interesting is that we have very little in the way of voter fraud has been actually proven.
Right.
And some of the major cases have been, actually by Republicans who've been involved in voter fraud. So in this particular sense, people are beating on a wrong, dead horse. But the question I want to ask you is now when you think about Detroit, Georgia,
Mhm.
and you think about the work of people like you're talking about your generation, Stacey Abrams and people like that, and those folks who really getting the vote. How do you see that as a model to around the country in terms of getting that work and organizing that community?
I think it's just a model that can be replicated easily throughout the country, especially now in this age of strong social media, which I think was responsible or largely responsible for President Barack Obama's election.
Mhm.
Because I remember, thinking as a little kid, and even in college, when Jesse Jackson ran in '88, I didn't think he had a chance. I still supported him, but I didn't actually think I would see an African-American president in my lifetime. So then when Senator Barack Obama ran in 2008, because we had this strong social media presence and young hip hop artists, young college students galvanized through that and were able to get Barack Obama elected, I knew that is the reason why. And so I also see that as a way to replicate sort of what Stacey Abrams did nationwide. Just like I think what she did, we can use that model to fight this, Georgia voting bill.
Mhm.
And the funniest part about it, of this voting bill, is the piece where we talked about restricting water.
Mhm.
And we were talking about this before, earlier, not on camera, but off camera, about, I guess, the restricting of water so you can't influence, people that are voting, but then lobbying is allowed, and lobbying is like, that's millions, maybe even billions of dollars that are being contributed to Congress to control votes. And who are the largest lobbyists? The pharmaceutical companies. And then we have the problem of opiate addiction in this country that we talked about earlier.
Right.
So it's interesting that lobbying is still allowed, but then you want to stop people from giving people water at the polls.
Mhm.
It's just disingenuous to me.
Right.
Totally disingenuous.
Right. You can give unlimited amounts of money now, and it depends on how you give it. And that again is another Supreme Court case. A new book just came out. It's called, I think it's called Unequal Justice, Unequal Justice. And what the author does is look at how the Supreme Court over the last 50 years or so has really been delivering one case after another to the benefit of the billionaire, the corporate billionaire class, which is pretty much, like you say, running the show through these contributions, among other things, to these elected officials, both Democrat and Republican.
Right, definitely. And I think that's a good segue to our last piece that we wanted to talk about, because we talk about the pharmaceutical companies. So talking about pharmaceuticals and the coronavirus vaccine, and not just the vaccine, the virus, itself. And the fact that since the vaccine has come out, it seems like people are getting kind of relaxed, and we see that cases are actually going up.
Right.
And one thing I definitely want to address was this, Asian hate, that was taking place due to coronavirus. And I think it goes back to, I didn't hear it myself, but did Donald Trump actually call it the China virus?
Well, the Chinese flu, he called it China flu.
Kind of called the Chinese flu. And then, you're going to have some people who are ignorant and, they don't just lump all Asians together. I guess it's been some attacks and whatever. And I wanted to address that because just a couple of shows back, I was talking about Asians controlling the Black beauty industry. And when I was saying that, I want to be clear in that I was not looking to vilify Asians. I was actually trying to say that we need to take a page out of their book as far as that economic reciprocity that they have in their community, and that most ethnic groups have in their community, Mexican, Jewish, Italian, that the dollar doesn't, it touches down in their community about 9 to 30 times before it leaves the community. Mm-hmm. But in our community, it leaves, almost immediately. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to make that point as far as, with some of this Asian hate that's going on, is that's definitely not what I was doing when I was talking about the Black hair care industry. But switching back to the virus, why do you think the virus is actually, cases of the virus are actually increasing despite the fact that we had this vaccine?
Well, I think one of the reasons is because people are we in this country, we tend to have we look for a silver bullet. We look for the one thing that's going to solve all our problems right away. And this is a complex virus. It's a complex pandemic, and it's not going to be any one thing. And right now, what we know is that the UK variant is now the most widely spread. It's the most dominant variant now. And that one spreads easier, and it's more deadly. So there's also kind of a generational difference, I believe. I haven't looked at the data, but in terms of how we look at the older people have been taking the bulk of the hits in terms of this thing, generally speaking. Now, when you look at our community, we have a lot larger share of the people under 55 who have died from the COVID-19 than whites do. And Latinos also have a larger number than whites, not quite as large as our numbers. So a lot of people are afraid of the vaccine, for instance, because they think it will do a lot of things to you. But right now we are dying at this point. We are dying at 3 times the rate of whites. And we've lost 3 years in our lifespan. Black folks in this country have lost 3 years, have been chopped off of the expected lifespan. And there have been other kind of economic things from this virus. So we need to take it, I think, more seriously. And so we see people going to spring break type of stuff, going down to the beach, jamming the beaches, and then no masking, no distancing. Matter of fact, you try and get as close as you can when you get down on that beach, and then you go home. I mean, because people are flying in from all kinds of places, going to, Florida, and they're going to, people coming into Virginia Beach from all over the place. and then they go home. So those are what we call super spread events. But the other thing is that we've been having high school sports,
Mm.
um, and you have young people who are playing sports, basketball, which is pretty much inside, and you're gonna do a lot of breathing, and you're up on each other, and you might get the virus. So what people don't understand is the majority of people who are infected by the virus don't get sick and have no symptoms, but they are infected. So they're the ones who are the spreaders. So you'll see people walking around looking healthy, but they are actually the spreaders. So let's say you have young people who are living at home, maybe with their grandparents or parents, or maybe 3 generations, and they come back, they carrying the virus, but they don't feel anything. They feel okay, and then they infect other people. So that's part of youth sports is one of the problems, in terms of this sort of thing. It's especially the ones that are out inside and where you can't do any social. I mean, you can't do any distancing.
Right.
So those are real problems. And then, like you say, you had the Super Bowl and people got together and looked at the Super Bowl. You had Easter just now. Um, you had the NCAA finals. March Madness. And people's in some states they opened everything up. So Texas, they had the baseball game the other day, Astros, and people were shoulder to shoulder just like it was a regular time period. Um, and going to the bars, for going to sports bars in some of those states, in some of those localities. And so when people leave, because if you go to Houston to a baseball game, you're coming from all kinds of places. And then you go home. So those are super spreader kind of events. And sometimes, because these spread is so spread out, it's you don't know who's it doesn't really always add up, because some of these events are in small towns, rural areas, but a lot of them are now concentrated, especially you see it in Michigan again. Michigan had gotten had it rough, and it's having it rough again. So we need to be cautious. We need to continue, even if you've been vaccinated, you still need to wear your mask, do your social distancing. We need to get over our fear of the vaccine. From my perspective, fear of the vaccines. I know there are a number of reasons to fear any kind of any of this stuff, because we know from history some of the things that have happened right here in Richmond, in Virginia. And the first heart operation, pretty much took a heart from a young black man and gave it to a white man. They did that several times. People talk about the Tuskegee experiment a lot, but people don't realize that experiment was led by somebody from the University of Virginia, a white gentleman from there, a researcher. So, so we have every city where you have black folks, they've had bad experience with the teaching hospitals.
Hmm.
So we've had these things, but we have to kind of think about and weigh and look at as much as possible um, the data in terms of what have we done in the past in terms of vaccines, how have they been used. When I was a kid coming up, you had stuff called polio, and that affected young people more than older people, and everyone then was glad to get vaccinated. We lined up at the school to get vaccinated because
And now that's pretty much been eliminated, hasn't it?
yeah, pretty much
Right.
eliminated.
Pretty much eliminated.
Smallpox as well. Uh, so so these are some of the things we've had experiences with, that where you didn't have a political divide around whether or not to really partake of it. But
So
I understand people's unwillingness. I mean,
mhm.
I understand, uh, some of the fear factor, but definitely this is not the time right now to really let the guard down, because the variants that are spreading around the country now are much more prevalent and dangerous, and And so we need to kind of keep our guard up,
So,
especially as a community.
so we just need to stay vigilant until this thing is
Be vigilant.
completely over.
It's not going away by itself.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and I think it's going to be around. You know, people are trying to get. I think it's going to be around. You know, they talk about the end of this year, but I think it's going to be around a little bit longer than that. I think it's going to take a little bit longer to really get a clamp. So this thing is tricky to get a handle on it around the world, because unless you get around the world, you know, right now 4,000 people are dying a day in Brazil, and the Black community in Brazil is taking the weight. It's the Black community that's really suffering more and dying more than anybody else in Brazil. And Bolsonaro, when he was campaigning, was so anti-Black. It was so his statements were so racist, man. And so from the very beginning, he showed there's very little concern, or in fact, not only little concern, he was antagonistic to the Black community, and you see that in terms of how it's getting dealt with in the country right now. So, the virus doesn't need a passport to get from one country to the other.
Definitely not. And it shouldn't be a partisan issue, but it has been. Yeah. But it, you know, regardless of what side of the aisle you profess to be on, we need to just stay, keep our guards up and stay vigilant until this thing is hopefully, I wouldn't necessarily say defeated, but contained at some point. Okay.
Yeah. Let me say something about the Asian thing while you, because the virus also it doesn't depend what country you're in. We need to fight this thing. But Jennifer Ho, who's one of the leaders in the Asian American community, just recently issued a statement. And in that statement, she said that the reason for this anti-Asian sentiment is white supremacy. And she says you might see a lot of pictures of Black folks beating all Asian people and whatnot, but she says, and she says the media is concentrating on those pictures, but she says still the largest number of those attacks are coming from whites. And she says even when Blacks are doing these things, it's few or Latinos are doing these things, she says fueled by this white supremacy that's promoting this. So she's saying the key to fighting anti-Black violence, anti-Latino violence, anti-Asian violence is to fight and defeat white supremacy. Once you defeat white supremacy as an ideological and a material kind of reality, then you can defeat these other kinds of negative forces. So I thought it was because you had some people in the Asian American community, even early on, who were moving in a right-wing position. Mm-hmm. And she took a stand along with a number of others, especially some of the younger Asian American spokespeople, took a very progressive position around this question.
All right, well, that's a powerful statement, and I'm definitely going to look for that on Google. Probably post it in the comments. And I think that's a good place for us to end on this episode. We touched on several topics. We missed Dre, the oral historian, but hopefully he'll be back with us next week. So for all of you watching us on YouTube and listening on the podcast, again, we thank you for your support, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.